Hello, and welcome back to Fluent Flow English. If this is your first time here, this is the channel where you improve your English while listening to real ideas about real life. Not textbook conversations, not boring grammar drills. Real thoughts in clear English at a pace you can actually follow. Today, I want to talk about a feeling. Maybe you know this feeling already. Maybe you felt it this morning. You look at your life, and a quiet voice inside your head says, "You are behind. Behind in your career. Behind in your relationships. Behind in your English even. Behind in whatever your life is supposed to look like by now." I want to be honest with you. This feeling is one of the most common feelings among adults today, in almost every country, in almost every culture, and yet almost nobody talks about it openly. So today, we are going to talk about it. We are going to look at where this feeling comes from, why it lies to us more than it tells the truth, and what we can actually do about it. Let's start with a simple question. Behind whom exactly? Think about that for a second. When you say, "I am behind," behind who? Behind your old classmate who now has a big house? Or to that friend of yours who you always hung out with? Behind your cousin who got married last year? Behind some stranger on Instagram who seems to travel every single month? The word behind only makes sense if there is a race, and if there is a fixed finish line that everyone is running towards. But is that true? Is life really one race with one finish line and one correct time to arrive? I don't think so. And by the end of this episode, I hope you won't think so either. Let me tell you about a woman named Priya. She's not someone I know personally, actually. A friend told me her story, and I found it interesting enough to share here. Priya was 34 years old. She had a decent job, a small apartment, and a few close friends. Nothing dramatic, nothing terrible, just an ordinary life. But every year, at her family gatherings, someone would ask the same questions. Are you married yet? Are you still renting? Don't you want children before it's too late? Priya told my friend something that stayed with me. She said, "I don't feel unhappy with my life until someone reminds me what my life is supposed to look like." That sentence is worth repeating. She wasn't unhappy with her actual life. She became unhappy the moment her life was compared to an imaginary schedule that other people believed in. This is exactly how the feeling behind trap works. It rarely comes from inside you first. It usually comes from outside, and then it moves inside, and eventually it feels like your own thought, even though it started somewhere else entirely. So where does this imaginary schedule come from? Let's break it down a little. Part of it comes from family and culture, of course. Many cultures have a fairly clear idea of what a normal life should look like, and by what age each part should happen. Finish school, get a stable job, get married, buy a house, have children, retire with savings. This isn't necessarily wrong. For some people, this path fits perfectly, and there's nothing wrong with wanting exactly that. The problem isn't the path itself. The problem is treating it as the only correct path, and measuring every single person against it, no matter how different their situation is. Another part of it, and honestly a bigger part now than it was 20 years ago, comes from social media. You open your phone in the morning, and within 5 minutes, you have seen someone's wedding, someone's new car, someone's promotion, someone's baby announcement, and someone's dream vacation photos. Your brain doesn't process this as one small piece of information about one person. Your brain processes it as evidence. Evidence that everyone else is moving forward, and you, somehow, are standing still. But here's something worth remembering, and I'll say it simply. Nobody posts their Tuesday. Nobody posts the argument they had with their partner, the rejection letter they received, the loan they're still paying off, or the night they cried in their car in a parking lot because everything felt like too much. You are comparing your full, complicated, ordinary life to other people's most polished 5 seconds. Now, let's talk about something a little deeper. Why does this feeling hurt so much, specifically? I think it's because it doesn't just make us sad. It makes us doubt our own judgment. When you feel behind, you don't just think, my timeline is different. You start to think, maybe I made the wrong choices. Maybe I wasted years. Maybe something is actually wrong with me. And that thought is far more dangerous than simple sadness, because it attacks your ability to trust yourself. Let me give you a very specific example, something a language learner might actually feel. Imagine you've been studying English for 2 years. You can read fairly well. You can understand most podcasts. But when you try to speak, the words don't come out smoothly. Then you meet someone who started learning only 8 months ago, and somehow they speak more fluently than you. What happens in your mind? If you are not careful, your mind says something cruel. I'm not talented. I'm too slow. Maybe I'll never really speak well. But here is what your mind is ignoring completely. You don't know that person's full story. Maybe they live with an English-speaking partner. Maybe they moved to a country where they had no choice but to speak every single day. Maybe they had 1 hour of speaking practice for every 10 minutes you had. You saw the result. You didn't see the conditions that created the result. This is true for almost every comparison we make in life, not only language learning. We see somebody's current position, and we quietly assume it says something about our own worth. It usually doesn't. It mostly says something about a completely different set of starting points, opportunities, and circumstances. Let's pause here for a moment, because I want you to actually think, not just listen. Ask yourself honestly, who is the person you compare your life to most often? Take a second. A specific person came to your mind, didn't they? Now ask a second question. Do you actually know their full story, or do you only know the version they choose to show? I think if you're honest, in most cases, you only know the highlights. Let's talk about where this feeling shows up most often, because it's not really one single feeling. It's more like a family of feelings, and they show up in different areas of life, at different volumes. Career is probably the loudest one for a lot of people. You're sitting at your desk, or maybe you're between jobs, and somebody from university posts about their new position at some big company. Suddenly your own job, the one you were actually fine with yesterday, feels small. Not because anything about your job changed. It didn't. Only the comparison changed. Relationships are another big one. And this one can be even more painful, honestly, because it touches something very personal. Maybe you're single, and everyone around you seems to be getting married. Maybe you're in a relationship, but it's not as picture-perfect as the couples you see online. Maybe you don't want marriage or children at all, but you still feel a strange pressure, like you need to explain your choice to people who never even asked. And then there's money and property, and this one is almost universal. Somebody buys a house, and it doesn't even matter whether you wanted a house at that point in your life. Something inside says, I should have that too by now. Notice something here, actually. In all 3 examples, the pattern is the same. Something happens to someone else. That event, by itself, changes absolutely nothing about your own life. And yet your emotional reaction to your own life shifts anyway. That gap between "nothing actually changed" and "I suddenly feel worse," that gap is where comparison does its quiet damage. Now, I want to be fair here, because I don't want to give you the wrong idea. Comparison isn't always bad. Sometimes it's genuinely useful. If you see someone speak English confidently, and it makes you think, "I want to work toward that too," that's not a problem. That's motivation, and motivation is a gift. The trouble starts when the thought quietly changes shape. It moves from "I want to work toward that" to "I'll never be as good as them." Same starting point. Completely different destination. There's actually a simple test you can use here. Ask yourself, after this comparison, do I feel like moving or do I feel like giving up? If a comparison makes you want to practice, to try, to take one small action, keep it. It's doing something good for you. If a comparison makes you want to close the app, sit quietly, and feel bad for the rest of the evening, that comparison isn't helping you. It's just hurting you, and you don't owe it your attention. Let me tell you about somebody else now, a man this time. And again, this is a story a listener actually shared with me a while ago in a comment, and I've thought about it many times since. His name was Daniel. At least, that's what he called himself in the comment. He was 29, working in a small accounting firm, and by his own words, not doing anything impressive. Then his old roommate from college started a business, and within 2 years, that roommate was being interviewed on a fairly well-known podcast about entrepreneurship. Daniel said something that really stuck with me. He said watching that interview didn't just make him jealous. It made him feel like his entire 20s had been wasted, in his own words, because he hadn't built something big and public like that. But here's the part of his comment that changed my mind about what to say to him, if I ever got the chance. He wrote, almost as an afterthought, "I guess in those 2 years I did get promoted twice. I paid off my student loan completely, and I finally started therapy after avoiding it for years." He wrote that sentence like it meant nothing, like it was just background information before the real point of his comment. But that sentence was the real point. 2 promotions, a cleared loan, the courage to start therapy. None of that made a good headline. None of it would get invited onto a podcast. But if you actually put his 2 years next to his roommate's 2 years, side by side, honestly, Daniel's 2 years were full of real, difficult, meaningful progress. It just didn't look like progress, because it didn't look loud. This happens constantly, and I want you to notice it in your own life too. We measure our years by the 1 or 2 visible headlines, and we completely ignore the 10 quiet wins sitting underneath them. Now, let's talk a little bit about where a lot of this pressure actually starts, because I think it's worth understanding, even if we can't easily fix it. A lot of it starts in childhood, inside families, inside culture, long before social media ever existed. Think about the questions many of us grew up hearing, directly or indirectly. What are you going to study? When are you going to get a proper job? When are you getting married? When are you having children? When are you buying your own place instead of renting? These questions usually come from people who love us. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. They're often not trying to hurt us. In many cases, they're repeating the same questions that were once asked of them, decades earlier, in a completely different world, with completely different economic conditions. But repeated often enough, from childhood onward, These questions slowly turn into a fixed idea in our heads. An idea that says, there is one correct order for a life and one correct age for each part of it. And once that idea is fixed in your mind, it becomes very easy to feel like a failure the moment your real life doesn't match that imaginary order, even if your real life is actually going quite well. I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying family expectations are always wrong, or that tradition has no value. For a lot of people, that traditional path genuinely fits, and there's real comfort and meaning in following it. What I am saying is this: a path that fits one person perfectly can fit another person terribly, and neither person is wrong for the life they end up choosing. Let's pause again for a second, and this time I want an even more specific answer from you. Think of one expectation, just one, that you felt pressure about, maybe from family, maybe from your culture, maybe just from watching everyone around you. Got one in your mind? Good. Now ask yourself honestly, is this something I actually want for myself, or is this something I've simply never questioned because everyone around me treats it as normal? That question alone, asked honestly, can be surprisingly uncomfortable. But discomfort here is a good sign. It usually means you touched something real. There's one more piece I want to add before we move toward what actually helps, and it's about language learning specifically, since I know a large part of you watching this are here to build your English, not just to think about life philosophy. Feeling behind shows up in language learning in a very particular, very sneaky way. It doesn't usually say, "You're bad at English." That would almost be easier to fight against directly. Instead, it whispers something quieter and more convincing. Everyone else seems to be improving faster than you. And because learning a language is invisible most of the time, nobody can see your brain slowly building new neural pathways. It's incredibly easy to feel like you're the only one moving slowly. Here's something worth knowing, and I say this from watching thousands of learners over the years, not just from theory. Fluency almost never grows in a straight line. It grows in a strange, uneven shape, flat for weeks, then suddenly a small jump, then flat again, then a bigger jump. If you happen to compare yourself to somebody else during one of your flat periods, and they happen to be in one of their jump periods, of course it will feel like they're improving faster. You're not actually comparing skill level. You're mostly comparing two different points on two different, uneven curves. Now, I want to shift the conversation a little, because understanding the problem is useful, but it's not enough on its own. Let's talk about what actually helps. The first thing that helps, and it sounds almost too simple, is changing the question you ask yourself. Instead of asking, "Am I behind?" try asking, "Am I moving?" These sound similar, but they are completely different questions. Am I behind? Always needs another person as a reference point. Am I moving? Only needs one person as a reference point. The you from last year, or the you from 5 years ago? Let's actually test this. Think about your English, specifically, since that's probably one reason you're listening to this. Are you better today than you were 1 year ago? Take a real moment and think. Don't just say yes automatically. Can you understand more? Can you read faster? Can you follow a video like this one without pausing every 10 seconds? For most of you listening right now, if you're honest, the answer is yes. You have moved. Maybe not as far as you hoped. Maybe slower than you wanted. But you have moved. And moving is the actual point, not arriving at some imaginary finish line by some imaginary deadline. The second thing that genuinely helps is separating two different feelings that we often confuse: dissatisfaction and inadequacy. Dissatisfaction says, "I want something different from my future." That's healthy. That's actually useful. It can push you to make real changes. Inadequacy says, "There is something wrong with who I am." That's not useful at all. It doesn't push you forward. It just quietly drains your energy. Here's a practical way to tell them apart. When you notice yourself thinking, "I'm behind," ask this follow-up question: behind or just different? If the honest answer is, "I genuinely want to change this part of my life," that's dissatisfaction, and you can plan around it. If the honest answer is, "I just feel bad because someone else has something I don't have," that's very likely comparison dressed up as inadequacy, and it deserves far less of your attention than you're currently giving it. There's a third thing that helps too, and it's a little less obvious than the first two. So stay with me here. It's about where you get your information from. I don't mean that in some vague, mystical way. I mean it very practically. If most of your information about normal progress comes from social media, your idea of normal will be completely distorted, almost guaranteed, because social media is, by design, a collection of unusually good moments from an unusually large number of people. Think about it mathematically for a second, even though I promise this isn't a maths lesson. If you follow, say, 800 people online, and each of those people only posts their best month once or twice a year, you are seeing something like 1,500 best months every single year. Your own life only gives you 12 months, most of them fairly ordinary. Of course, a feed built entirely from other people's best months is going to look more exciting than your one real ordinary year. It's not that their lives are actually more exciting than yours, it's that you're comparing a highlights reel built from thousands of people against the full, unfiltered footage of just one life, your own. So one practical thing you can genuinely try, starting today if you want, is simply noticing how you feel after using social media for 20 or 30 minutes. Not judging yourself for using it. That's not the point here. Just noticing. If you consistently feel a little smaller, a little more anxious, a little more behind after scrolling, that's useful information. It doesn't mean you have to delete every app tomorrow. It just means you now know something true about the effect it has on you, and you can decide with open eyes how much space you actually want to give it. Let me bring back Priya's story for a moment, because I think it makes this clearer. After years of feeling behind, she eventually asked herself a simple question during a particularly hard family dinner. She asked, "If nobody in my family ever asked me these questions again, would I actually be unhappy with my current life?" And she realized, quietly, that the honest answer was no. Her life wasn't the problem. The constant comparison to somebody else's schedule was the problem. That doesn't mean she stopped wanting things. She still wanted certain things to change eventually. But she stopped believing that wanting them later, on her own timeline, made her a failure right now. I want to talk about one more idea before we finish. And honestly, this might be the most important part of this whole episode. Invisible progress. A lot of the most meaningful growth in a person's life doesn't show up in a photo. It doesn't fit into a caption. Nobody can see it from the outside. Think about what invisible progress can actually look like. Maybe you've become calmer during stressful conversations compared to a few years ago. Maybe you've become better at admitting when you're wrong. Maybe you've learned to sit with an uncomfortable emotion instead of immediately escaping it. Maybe, and this is a real one for many of you, maybe you've become brave enough to speak English out loud, in front of strangers, even though it feels uncomfortable, even though you make mistakes, even though a small part of you is scared of sounding foolish. None of that fits into a highlight photo. None of it gets 100 likes. But all of it is real, and honestly, some of it matters more than the things people usually post about. Let me get even more specific, because I think vague encouragement doesn't actually help much, and I'd rather give you something you can hold on to. Think about the version of you from exactly 1 year ago today. Not 5 years ago. That's often too easy, too obvious. Just 1 year. Would that version of you have handled a recent difficult conversation the way you just handled it? Would that version of you have kept practicing a new skill after failing at it publicly, the way you did last month? Would that version of you have recognized a bad habit forming and stopped it early, instead of only noticing it months later, the way you managed to do recently? If your honest answer to even one of those questions is yes, that's not nothing. That's evidence. Real, specific evidence that contradicts the vague feeling of being behind. And I think this matters more than people realize. Feelings are loud, but they're not always accurate. Evidence is quieter, but it's usually far more honest. I also want to say something about timing, because I think it deserves its own moment here, rather than being squeezed into a quick tip. We live in a culture that talks a lot about wasted time, as though any year that didn't produce a visible achievement was somehow thrown away. I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's fair, either to you or to anyone else. A year where you struggled with anxiety but slowly learned to manage it wasn't wasted. A year where you tried something, failed, and had to start over wasn't wasted. A year where you simply survived a genuinely hard period of your life without falling apart completely wasn't wasted. These years don't usually get celebrated the way graduations and weddings get celebrated. But they are often the years that quietly build the strength you'll rely on for everything that comes afterward. Here's something that might surprise you, though maybe it won't, if you've been paying close attention. The person you compare yourself to most often, the one who seems to have everything figured out, quite possibly feels behind too, just measured against a different person, a different standard, a different imaginary schedule. Think about that businessman who gets interviewed on podcasts, the one Daniel compared himself to earlier. It's entirely possible he looks at other entrepreneurs, ones with bigger companies, more funding, more media attention, and feels exactly the same quiet panic Daniel felt watching him. The circle doesn't have a clear bottom. Almost everyone, at every level, can find somebody slightly further ahead, in some specific direction, and feel small next to them if they choose to look in that particular direction long enough. This isn't meant to be a depressing thought. Actually, I find it strangely comforting. It means the feeling of being behind isn't proof that you're uniquely failing at life. It's closer to a shared, almost universal glitch in how human brains process information about other humans. Nearly everyone experiences some version of it. The people who seem the most confident have usually just gotten better at not showing it, or better at questioning it privately before it takes over. Let's talk about a small, practical habit now. Something you could genuinely start using this week. Not just something to nod along with and then forget by tomorrow. When you notice the behind feeling rising, and you will notice it, because it's a completely normal human reaction, not a personal flaw. Try this short sequence in your head. First, name it. Just quietly say to yourself, "This is the comparison feeling again." That alone creates a small amount of distance between you and the feeling, instead of being completely inside it. Second, ask what triggered it. A photo? A conversation? A specific person's update? Naming the trigger usually shrinks its power a little because vague dread feels much bigger than a specific, identifiable cause. And third, ask the question we practiced earlier. Am I moving compared to my own past, regardless of where anyone else currently stands? Before we get to those 3 steps in detail, I want to clear up something that confuses a lot of people, because I think it quietly stops them from even trying. Some of you might worry that being kind to yourself about feeling behind is just a soft excuse to stop trying, to become lazy, to lower your standards. I understand that worry. It's not a silly one, but there's an important difference between self-compassion and self-pity, and confusing the two causes a lot of unnecessary trouble. Self-pity says, "My life is unfair, so there's no point in trying." It keeps you stuck, and honestly, it usually makes the behind feeling stronger over time, not weaker. Self-compassion says something quite different. It says, "I'm struggling with something real right now, and I can still take one small step forward anyway." Self-compassion doesn't remove your ambition. It just removes the extra, unnecessary layer of cruelty you add on top of an already difficult situation. Here's a simple way to test which one you're actually practicing. Self-pity usually leaves you feeling heavier afterward, and a little more like giving up than before. Self-compassion, even though it might feel emotional in the moment, usually leaves you feeling slightly lighter, a little more capable of taking the next small action. If you're not sure which one you're doing, just notice how you feel 5 minutes later. That's usually enough to tell you the truth. Okay, now let's get back to those 3 small steps. That's it. 3 small steps, taken maybe 15 seconds total once it becomes familiar. Nothing dramatic. But small, repeated moments like this, done consistently over weeks and months, quietly retrain how your mind responds to comparison. The same patient way that consistent practice slowly retrains your mind to respond to English. Actually, that comparison isn't accidental. Language learning and this whole feeling behind idea are more connected than they might first appear. Both involve a skill that grows slowly, unevenly, and mostly invisibly. Both are constantly compared against other people through public visible moments, a fluent conversation, a promotion, a wedding, while the private, unglamorous practice behind those moments stays completely hidden. And in both cases, the people who eventually succeed aren't usually the ones who never felt behind. They're the ones who kept showing up anyway, feeling behind sometimes, and continuing regardless. So, here's what I want to leave you with today. The next time that voice in your head whispers, "You're behind," I want you to pause, just for a second, and ask 2 quiet questions. First, behind whom, specifically, and do I actually know their full story? Second, am I moving, even slowly, even imperfectly, compared to who I used to be? Most of the time, once you actually sit with those questions instead of running from the feeling, the panic gets smaller. Not because your life suddenly changed, because your perspective did. Before we close, let's practice a few natural expressions from today's episode. Expressions you can genuinely use in real conversations. First expression, feeling behind. You might say, "I've been feeling behind at work lately." Simple, natural, very commonly used among English speakers when talking about stress or pressure. Second expression, highlight reel. This means the best, most exciting parts of something, usually shown publicly, while the difficult parts stay hidden. You could say, social media only shows people's highlight reel. Third expression, on your own timeline. This means moving at your own pace, without matching someone else's schedule. You might say, everyone grows on their own timeline. Fourth expression, invisible progress. We use this one quite a lot today. It describes real growth that other people simply can't see from the outside. A natural sentence might be, I've made a lot of invisible progress this year, even if it doesn't show. And one more, a slightly more informal one. Comparing apples to oranges. This is a very common idiom, and it means comparing two things that are actually too different to compare fairly. You could say, comparing my situation to hers is like comparing apples to oranges. Our starting points were completely different. Try using at least one of these expressions today, even in a small sentence to yourself. That single sentence is more valuable for your fluency than memorizing 20 new words you'll never actually use, sitting quietly in a notebook you never open again. Now, before you go, I want you to actually do something, not just listen and move on. Take out your phone, open a notes app, and write down one honest answer to this question. What is one piece of invisible progress you've made this year that nobody else has noticed? Just one sentence. You don't need to share it with anyone. You just need to see it written down, in your own words, so your brain remembers that it's true. If you want to go a little further, and I genuinely recommend it if you have 5 extra minutes today, try writing a short note to the version of yourself from exactly 1 year ago. Not a long letter, nothing dramatic. Just a few honest sentences. Tell that version of you what actually happened this year, including the parts that didn't go according to plan. Tell them what you're proud of, even the quiet things, even the things nobody applauded. You might notice, while writing it, that the year looks a lot more complete than the vague, anxious summary your mind usually gives it. And maybe, if you feel comfortable, write one more short note. This time, to the version of you, 1 year from now. Not a list of demands or impossible goals, just a simple wish. What do you hope that future version of you remembers about how you treated yourself during the harder, slower, less impressive months? That question tends to matter more, over time, than almost any specific achievement you could write down instead. If this episode gave you something worth thinking about, that's genuinely enough. You don't need to feel completely fixed by the end of a single video. And honestly, you probably won't be. And that's fine too. Real change happens slowly, quietly, in the background, the same way most real progress always does. The same way your English is improving right now. One episode, one sentence, one small moment of understanding at a time, whether you can feel it happening or not. Keep listening. Keep practicing your English, a little every day, without comparing your day 10 to somebody else's day 1000. And I'll see you in the next episode here on Fluent Flow English.